When I was 13, my family took me camping. The next morning, I woke up alone. No footprints, no gear, just gone. Days later, a ranger found me. When he called my parents, Dad said, "Wrong number." Then, forget we ever existed. Years later, I did something that shattered their world. Hi everyone, I'm Noah, 28 now, and this story starts back when I was 13. It's complicated, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I've told bits and pieces to a few friends over the years, but never the whole thing. Maybe sharing it here will help. I grew up in a small town in Oregon. My parents, Darren and Celia, weren't the warmest people, but I thought they cared in their own way. At least, that's what I told myself. They worked hard, or so I was told, though they never really talked about what they did. I barely saw them outside of the usual dinners or the occasional weekend outing. Those weekends were never fun. My dad was always on edge, like he had a short fuse waiting to blow, and my mom was more distant than affectionate. They weren't cruel exactly, just cold. I learned pretty early on that any mistake or misstep would get met with sharp looks or pointed comments. I learned to keep quiet, to stay out of the way. When summer came before my 8th grade year, they announced that we were going camping. Not the typical family-friendly campground with electricity and clean bathrooms. No, they said this was going to be real camping. Remote, deep in the woods near Mount Hood. I was cautiously excited. Part of me hoped this would be the trip that finally pulled us together, that we'd laugh, tell stories, maybe have a moment where we all felt like a family. That hope lasted about half a day. We drove for hours, packed into the old, rusting SUV, the windows down because my dad insisted the fresh mountain air would be good for me. I wasn't sure if that meant my allergies or my attitude, but I didn't ask. When we arrived, it was already late afternoon. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and everything felt quiet except for the occasional bird or rustling leaves. The campsite was off the beaten path, barely marked by a rough clearing in the trees. No other campers in sight. My dad started setting up the tent immediately, barking instructions at me and my mom. "Hand me the stakes, Celia." "No, Noah, don't touch the firewood. Just keep an eye out for branches." They sounded like a team, but their tone was cold and clipped, like they were on a mission, not a vacation. I tried to help where I could, but I felt like I was just in the way. I noticed my mom's hand shaking a little as she unpacked the cooler. She caught me looking and gave me a sharp look. "Just stay busy, Noah." That night, after the fire was built and the cold mountain air settled around us, I asked if we could tell stories or play some music. My dad grunted something about needing to rest early because tomorrow would be a long day. My mom didn't say anything. I could tell they were both tense, like there was some invisible weight hanging over them. I crawled into the tent by myself, hoping they'd come talk to me or at least say goodnight. But the tent was empty when I woke up. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No crackling fire. No sound of footsteps. No voices. I peeked outside, and the clearing was empty. Their tent was gone. The fire was just cold ashes. The backpacks, the cooler, even the SUV, they were all gone. I called out their names, over and over, but no answer. The forest seemed to swallow my voice. My heart pounded, but I tried not to panic. Maybe they went for a hike and forgot to tell me. Maybe this was some kind of game. I waited all morning, staying near the campsite, hoping they'd come back. But they never did. After a while, hunger and fear settled in, and I started walking toward what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead. I kept shouting, listening for any reply, but it was only the birds and the wind. By the second day, I was exhausted. I had no food, no water except what I could find from a small stream nearby. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they would come back for me. But the night was the worst. The woods at night aren't like the movies. It's dark, cold, and every sound makes you jump. I hugged myself tightly and tried to ignore the shadows moving just beyond my sight. It wasn't until the 4th day that a park ranger found me. He was on his usual patrol, saw me sitting near the trail, and called for backup. I was weak and dehydrated but alive. Relief washed over me like a flood. When the ranger called my parents, I was sure they'd be frantic, worried, ready to come get me. Instead, I heard something that shattered everything. "Wrong number," my dad said flatly. Then, after a pause, "Forget we ever existed." I froze. The ranger looked confused, then uncomfortable. I could feel my chest tighten as I realized this wasn't a mistake or some mix-up. They didn't want me. After that, I was placed with a foster family while social services tried to figure out what to do with me. I asked again and again about my parents, but no one could get through to them. It was like I had been erased. For years, I struggled with what that meant. Why did they leave me? Why did they deny me? Was I really so worthless they wanted me gone without a trace? I won't lie. Those years were hard, but I survived. I went to school, made friends, and slowly built a life where I didn't have to carry their rejection like a scar. And then, years later, I found a way to make them pay, not with violence or hate, but with the one thing they thought I'd never have, a life they couldn't ignore. After the Rangers' call, I was stuck in this strange limbo. Social services didn't have much to work with because my parents had vanished without a forwarding address or a single word to explain what had happened. I remember sitting in that sterile office, clutching a thin blanket as workers spoke quietly around me. It felt like I was shrinking into the floor, like the whole world was trying to forget I existed. The foster family that took me in was kind enough, quiet, steady people who didn't pry too much. They gave me space, but every night I'd lie awake wondering, why? Why would they just walk away like I was a mistake? I was 13, barely a kid, and they treated me like I was something dirty they had to throw away. School was a challenge at first. I was that quiet kid who didn't have a place to call home, who smelled like he slept in different places every few nights. But I worked hard, kept my head down, and avoided trouble. I didn't want to give anyone a reason to write me off like my parents had. As the months turned into years, I pieced together bits of my past. I found out my parents had been living a double life. Well, at least my dad had. I stumbled on some old paperwork tucked away in a filing cabinet at the school counselor's office, documents showing that Darren was involved in some shady business deals, something that no one talked about. It was like they had a secret they desperately wanted to keep buried. Maybe that was why they left me behind. My mom, Celia, seemed even colder than my dad. I later learned from a distant relative that she had been the one who pushed for me to be disappeared because she believed I was a liability. She told people I was a burden and embarrassment, words that stung every time I replayed them in my head. I was their son, but they treated me like I was a problem to be solved by ignoring me entirely. In the foster home, I buried those feelings deep. I told myself they were just broken people, and maybe I was better off without them. But inside, the anger simmered quietly, growing into something I couldn't ignore. By the time I was 18, I was done running from my past. I wanted answers, and more than that, I wanted them to know I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't the scared, abandoned kid lost in the woods. I started digging. Small things at first, public records, old social media accounts, even some discreet phone calls to people who might know. I found out my parents had moved out of state, changed their names, and started a new life without me. They erased me, like I was some shadow they wanted to forget. What really broke me was when I saw pictures online. They had built this perfect little family image without me. Happy dinners, vacations, smiling faces. Photos where I should have been. It was like a punch to the gut. But instead of breaking me, it lit a fire. I decided then that I would make sure they could never pretend I never existed. Not just by showing up. No, that wouldn't be enough. I needed something bigger. Something that would shatter their carefully constructed world. After years of silence, the moment I discovered the photos online hit me like a wave. I was scrolling through a community board for the town they had moved to, just hoping for any clue, a name, a face, anything, and suddenly there they were. There was my dad, Darren, grinning in front of a big house with a brand new truck parked outside. Next to him was my mom, Celia, laughing in a way that made me realize they never once missed me. And then there were two little kids, a boy and a girl, both younger than me. They looked like the perfect family. The kind you see in movies or on magazine covers. The worst part? I wasn't even a memory. Not a trace. I sat there staring at the screen, the room around me fading. Those pictures were a slap in the face. They had moved on, built a new life, erased the last 13 years of my existence without a single backward glance. But the anger didn't consume me the way I expected. It was quieter, colder, like a hard knot deep inside. I realized that if I wanted to be free of what they did to me, I couldn't just react. I had to be smarter than them. That's when I started to rebuild myself. I finished school with a focus on law and social services. I wanted to understand systems, how families could be torn apart, how to fight for those who were silenced. I worked odd jobs, saved every dollar, and slowly built a new version of myself. Someone who was no longer a scared kid lost in the woods, but a person with control. At the same time, I quietly collected information. It started small, public records, property deeds, court filings. I learned that Darren had faced several investigations for fraud, though nothing ever stuck. Celia was active in local charities, always the perfect volunteer. The town adored her. But beneath the polished surface, the truth was ugly. Neighbors whispered about how cold and controlling Celia was behind closed doors. Darren was ruthless in business, cutting down anyone who threatened his deals. The children were often left to fend for themselves, isolated in a mansion that looked more like a fortress. I realized they were monsters wearing masks of perfection. The thought of their carefully curated lives, built on lies and cruelty, made me more determined than ever. I began formulating a plan, not one born from hatred, but from a fierce desire to claim the story that was stolen from me. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices, to understand what it means to abandon a child, to erase them like they never mattered. But I knew I couldn't rush. They were smart, manipulative, and protected by layers of influence. I needed to be patient, methodical. The same way they had built their new life, I would dismantle it piece by piece. Over the years, I started reaching out to people connected to them, their acquaintances, distant relatives, even a former employee of Darren's who had been let go under suspicious circumstances. Each conversation was like a thread in a tapestry I was slowly weaving, a map of secrets and lies. I was learning more about who they really were, what they had done, and how much they were hiding. And then, one quiet afternoon, I received an anonymous tip. A single envelope slipped under the door of my small apartment. Inside was a photo of the house they lived in now, taken from across the street, and a note with just 3 words: they never left. I sat there, heart pounding, realizing that maybe this was just the beginning of the story they wanted to hide. That photo and note changed everything. They never left. The words echoed in my mind like a challenge. For years, I'd thought they'd simply abandoned me, erased me from their lives. But seeing that house, their fortress, and knowing they were still there, living their perfect lie, it felt like a door had cracked open. I wasn't as far away from them as I'd believed. I knew then that this was my chance. Not to just confront them, but to break the illusion they had built. To make sure everyone who ever looked up to them saw the truth. But I also knew this wouldn't be quick or easy. This was a long game, and I had to be careful. One wrong move, and I'd be back to square one, invisible and ignored. So I started small. First, I watched. For weeks, I drove by the house, memorizing the comings and goings without being seen. The neighborhood was quiet, upscale neighbors who nodded politely but didn't pry. Darren and Celia were careful, almost paranoid in their routines. Their children, the boy and girl I'd seen in those photos, barely left the property. It was like they were locked inside a gilded cage. One day, I noticed a delivery, an expensive package addressed to Celia. I watched as she took it inside, but what caught my attention was how tense she looked. It was nothing like the smiling, charitable woman the town adored. It was something darker: fear, maybe guilt. Around this time, I reached out again to the former employee of Darren's who'd been dismissed under mysterious circumstances. His name was Mark, and he was cautious but agreed to meet after I convinced him I wasn't there to cause trouble. He told me about the shady deals Darren had made, how he'd skimmed money from investments, intimidated partners, and manipulated records to cover his tracks. "Your dad's not just some bad businessman," Mark said quietly. "He's dangerous." "And your mom?" "She knew. She helped." That stuck with me, the idea that Celia wasn't just a bystander, but an active participant. It explained so much. The coldness. The way they discarded me like I was a piece of trash. I started digging deeper into the charity work Celia was involved in. On the surface, it was all perfect: fundraisers, community events, donations. But behind the scenes, I found signs of embezzlement, money funneling into accounts linked to Darren's business. Their perfect image was built on lies and theft. I made copies of everything. The next step was to find a way inside their world, not physically at first, but socially. I needed to get close enough to the people who believed in them, who trusted them, so I could plant seeds of doubt. Using a fake name and a carefully crafted story, I connected with some of Celia's charity contacts. I volunteered at events, slowly weaving myself into their circle. It was strange, being so close to the people who worshiped my parents without knowing the truth. But it gave me power, information, the ability to whisper doubts and watch them spread. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Darren. I learned he was pushing harder than ever on a new business deal, something risky, something that could collapse and take everything down with it. One evening, I followed him after a late meeting. He drove to a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, with a man I'd never seen before. The exchange was quick, tense, and when Darren got back in his car, he looked furious. I recorded everything on my phone. That night, I realized I had enough to start pulling the threads. I didn't want revenge that ruined people physically or emotionally. I wanted their empire to crumble, their reputation destroyed by the truth they hid so carefully. I wanted the town to see the monsters beneath the masks. I prepared a detailed dossier, documents, photos, recordings, and sent it anonymously to the local newspaper. Within days, the quiet, perfect family was under scrutiny. Reporters called neighbors. Questions were asked. The charities launched investigations. The business partners backed away. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed life began to crack. But here's the thing. They didn't break immediately. Darren and Celia fought back with everything they had: lawyers, threats, manipulation. They tried to silence the rumors, painting me as a liar, an outsider with a grudge. That only made me push harder. The real turning point came one rainy afternoon when I saw Celia's face on the front page of the newspaper, her smile gone, replaced by something close to desperation. Darren's name was dragged through the mud with allegations of fraud, abuse, and worse. They had underestimated me. They thought abandoning me meant I was nothing. But I was the storm they never saw coming. The weeks after the dossier went public were intense. Darren and Celia's world began to unravel in ways I hadn't fully imagined, though part of me knew it had to happen eventually. The town was stunned. People who once admired them now whispered behind their backs, eyes filled with disbelief and pity. The charities Celia had so carefully cultivated launched official investigations. The board members, shocked to learn how deep the corruption ran, removed her immediately. The money she had diverted was traced to accounts linked directly to Darren's business. Darren tried to keep up appearances, issuing statements calling the accusations baseless and malicious, but the evidence was overwhelming. His business partners pulled out, contracts were canceled, and banks froze accounts. One night, I heard from Mark, the former employee who had quietly come forward as a whistleblower. He told me Darren was furious but helpless, pacing the floors of the mansion as calls flooded in from lawyers and angry clients. Celia, on the other hand, had retreated into herself, refusing to leave her room except to attend required meetings. Their children, once distant and guarded, suddenly found themselves caught in the middle of a storm they didn't understand. Custody battles began, social workers stepped in, and whispers of neglect and emotional abuse circulated. All of this was a bitter justice, but I made sure to keep myself removed from the chaos. I didn't need their approval or forgiveness. I just needed to be free. A few months after everything went public, I decided it was time to face them, not out of anger, but closure. I showed up at the mansion, not as a desperate kid lost in the woods, but as a man who had taken back his story. They didn't recognize me at first. Celia's eyes widened. Darren's face went pale. There was no warmth, no apology, only the cold realization that the son they'd abandoned was standing there, unbroken. I stood in the grand, echoing entryway of their house, though calling it a house didn't feel quite right. It was more like a hollow shell dressed in polished wood and expensive silence. The marble floors glistened, the chandelier above me sparkled in the afternoon sun, and yet the air felt heavy, stale, almost untouched by real life. Darren and Celia stood just a few feet away, but it may as well have been a mile. They didn't speak at first. Celia looked at me like she was seeing a ghost, her mouth slightly open, her eyes narrow, calculating. Darren's jaw clenched, like he was holding in the urge to demand I leave. But he didn't. Not yet. I took a breath and started talking, not loud, not angry, just steady. I told them what it was like waking up alone that morning in the woods, how I waited, shivering, with my legs tucked into my chest, hoping they'd come back. I told them about the moment I realized they weren't coming back at all, that I had been deliberately left, thrown away. I spoke about the first night I spent in a stranger's home, lying on a too-small bed with tears I didn't want to let fall because I didn't know if the people in the next room were kind or cruel. About the months of pretending I was okay in school, head down, heart locked tight, because the second I let anyone in, it hurt too much. I talked about birthdays spent alone. Holidays passed with forced smiles and polite gifts from people who felt sorry for me, not people who truly knew me. I described the silence. Not just the kind you hear at night, but the kind that grows inside of you when you're a child and the two people who are supposed to love you most decide you're not worth the effort. I didn't want revenge at first, I told them, my voice soft but firm. I just wanted to understand. I wanted to believe there was a reason, that maybe something happened, maybe I was wrong. But the older I got, the more I realized, there was no reason. You left me because it was convenient. Because I didn't fit your plan. Celia didn't meet my eyes. Her gaze dropped to the floor, but there was no remorse, no sorrow. Just discomfort. as if what I was saying was an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. I never needed your approval, I said. Not then, not now. I survived without you. I built a life without you. But I needed you to hear this. I needed you to feel the weight of what you did. Darren looked older now, not just in the face, but in the posture. The kind of weariness that comes from knowing the mask can't be held up forever. His hands, once commanding and full of presence, now hung limply by his sides. I'm not here for your apology, I continued. I've stopped needing that, too. I'm here so you can never say you didn't know the damage you caused. So you can't hide behind your silence or your lies anymore. You left a child in the woods. You chose your image over your own son. And now the world knows. Still, they said nothing. Not a word. No explanations. No attempts to justify. Just silence. That silence said more than anything else ever could. It told me they knew I was right. It told me they were too cowardly to face it. It told me that even now, after everything, they couldn't be bothered to care, not really. And strangely, that was enough. I turned and walked away, down the long driveway lined with trees, out past the gates they had always kept shut. I didn't look back. I haven't since. In the years that followed, I rebuilt everything they tried to destroy. I went to college on scholarships I earned myself. I studied social work, then law, and now I spend my days helping children who have been neglected, abandoned, or overlooked. Kids who were told by the world that they didn't matter, but who do. I fight for them because I know what it means to be discarded. I listen. I stay. I show up. All the things Darren and Celia couldn't do. I build a small house near the edge of a quiet town. Not flashy, not perfect, but warm. Real. I fill it with books and music, with laughter when friends visit, with peace when I'm alone. I no longer wake up with that ache in my chest. I no longer wait for someone to explain why they hurt me. I stopped needing their version of love when I learned how to love myself. As for Darren and Celia, last I heard, they're still living in that mansion, though they rarely leave it anymore. The neighbors no longer wave. The charities that once fawned over Celia now refuse to return her calls. The foundation she built her reputation on was shut down. Darren's business is entangled in a slow, grinding legal process. The government is picking apart his finances piece by piece. Their children, my half-siblings, I suppose, were eventually removed from the home. They now live with extended relatives in another state. I don't know much about them, and maybe that's for the best. They deserve a chance to grow up without the shadows Darren and Celia cast. I sometimes wonder if those kids ever ask about me, if they know they had a brother once. Maybe someday they'll want to find me. If they do, I'll be here. Not with answers, necessarily, but with honesty. Because in the end, that's what all of this came down to. The truth. Sometimes, revenge doesn't look like fire or fury. Sometimes, it looks like healing. Like building something beautiful in the very spot where something was torn down. Like walking back into the house that broke you and walking out whole. I didn't just survive what they did. I outgrew it. I outgrew them. And I'm not invisible anymore.